I lived in it most of my life and bought it from my parents when they retired and moved to Florida. They offered to take over the mortgage, but I didn't want to do that and took out a loan from the bank. That way, they could get the money in a lump sum and use it to supplement their retirement funds. I wasn't rich by any standard, but as a teenager, I inherited a few bucks from my grandparents. Thanks to good advice from my dad and his investment advisor, that money grew over the years, and I had a substantial down payment, which made it easier to get a loan. I loved the house in the neighborhood. My parents took me there after I was born, and I went to school while living there. After high school, I worked as a journeyman until I had enough experience to take the exam for a licensed electrician. I passed the exam and did both residential and commercial electrical work before buying a house. During this time, I had several relationships, including one long-term and serious relationship. When I bought the house, my plan was to live in it with my wife when I got married and update the parts that I felt needed it. That plan didn't work out because I met and married Cheryl. We were married just under 2 years and lived in that house before everything went down. Some of the movies that are on TV are feel-good movies. They are written in such a way that they have a happy ending, of course. Many of them deal with long-lost love or old friends, and invariably, the main actor-actress finds themselves in a situation where they meet up again with an old flame. And again, invariably, the spark is rekindled and their first, truest love conquers all. Cheryl adored these movies and watched everything she could find. I watched enough to understand the formula of the script and that the writers had envisioned everything to ultimately provide a happy ending. Real life isn't like that, I tried to explain to her. One day we were at our local Giant store and ran into Richard Herbert. He hugged Cheryl and she hugged him back. When they were done hugging and admiring each other, she introduced him to me as an old friend. After that introduction, it was as if I didn't exist. They chatted for a few minutes while I stood rocking the cart back and forth and studying the rows of bean cans on a nearby shelf. I learned that there are at least 4 kinds of pinto beans, a dozen or more kinds of baked beans, 4 kinds of string beans, pork and beans, lima beans, garbanzo beans, and at least half a dozen other kinds of beans. While I studied the beans, the two of them reminisced about old times. When my patience had worn thin a bit, I reminded her that it was time for us to leave. When I did, they noisily exchanged phone numbers and promised to chat soon. I assumed their time in the store was pretty much the last time we'd see Richard Herbert. How wrong I was. 4 months later, I found myself in divorce court. Irreconcilable differences. That was the reason she wanted it. In those 4 months, I never once saw her and Herbert together, never heard a single rumor or gossip about anything going on between them, and none of our friends ever mentioned them together. She never said in court that I was a bad husband or lacking in anything. She simply said we had irreconcilable differences, and she didn't have to explain what that meant or give an example of such differences. The court just seemed to accept their existence without complaint and granted the divorce. My attorney told me that Cheryl would likely get alimony in the house. I was furious. I had heard of things like this happening, but I never thought it would happen to me. It was my house and I had owned it my whole life. And to think that she could live in it for less than 2 years, get a divorce for no reason other than love for an ex-boyfriend, and then get the house. My house. My lawyer couldn't make me believe it. No court system in the world would have allowed this to happen. In court, I told the judge my story and thought I deserved sympathy. Huh? Then I experienced firsthand that the court system is as horrible as I had heard about it. She did get the house, but she didn't get child support. After receiving the judgment, I decided not to go near the house again. I made this decision after remembering a country-style song about a divorced man who drives by his old house and sees the new man mowing the lawn. I had no desire to experience something like that. Then the house burned to the ground, and I sat and looked at the ashes. It happened on Thanksgiving Day, and Herbert, I probably shouldn't say this, was living there with Cheryl. He apparently wanted to deep fry the turkey rather than roast it, but it was raining and he couldn't cook it outside, so he tried to do it inside. It was reported in the newspapers and on television that while cooking, the stove flipped over, boiling hot oil hit the wood-burning fireplace and caused a fire that burned the house to the ground before firefighters could put it out. There were rumors that he tripped and knocked over the fryer, but no one had confirmed that. I took one last look at the pile of ashes, then drove to my apartment complex and put the frozen dinner in the microwave. While it cooked, I pulled out my copy of the divorce decree and read it. Again. It was like doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. No matter how many times I read it, the outcome was always the same. But that time I read it, I saw something and started smirking. Then I reread it. After the second reading, the smirk turned into a smile. 10 times I'd read that damn document and always got depressed, but this time was different. Over the next few minutes, my smile grew wider and wider as the plan was hatched. Maybe the outcome could be changed after all? The judgment didn't say anything about alimony, child support, or any other monetary amounts I would have to pay. But it did say that Cheryl would reside in the house at the address. And it did say the address it was located at, and that I was obligated to continue to make mortgage and insurance payments on the house. It didn't say for how long, and it didn't say what would happen to the house after the mortgage was no longer in effect, or what would happen in the unlikely event that the house ceased to exist. After all, who even thinks about crap like that? I assumed it was about me continuing to pay the mortgage and insurance, and the house becoming her property once the mortgage was paid in full. But there was no specific mention of that. It was as if the ordinance was written in a hurry and assumed that everyone knew what it wanted to say and followed that intent unquestioningly. I'm not a lawyer and have never played one on TV or anywhere else, so I can't interpret the law, but I can read and generally understand what I read. Also, I've known all my life that the law has both letter and intent, and was going to try to use the letter even though the intent may be completely different. The ordinance required me to insure the house, which I did, so I filed an application with the insurance company and told them that I needed the application to be processed promptly. They asked if I was going to rebuild the house. I replied that no, that I was moving. Since I was the owner on record and there was no evidence of fraud, I received a check a week later. The check contained what was left after paying off the bank, and that was enough to make me smile. So, my mortgage was paid off, I had a substantial amount of cash, and I was the owner of a pile of ashes located on a little over a quarter-acre lot. I walked over to a rented truck and filled it with my stuff. I also rented a car hauler, hitched it to the truck, and loaded my pickup truck filled with tools for my job. I received several calls and text messages from Cheryl, but they were all ignored. I had always wanted to visit the Northwest, so that's where I headed. I stopped in the first town that crossed the state line, opened a bank account, and transferred my money into it. I had no idea what the law was like, and I didn't know if they could prosecute me in another state, but I was willing to take the risk. I was afraid to talk to my lawyer for fear of what he would tell me, so I decided to hell with it and didn't talk to him. The worst that could happen was that the court could force me to give her the house, but my argument, however weak, was that the divorce decree specified a house at an address. It did not require some house or any house at some address. Since the house no longer existed, I figured I was relieved of liability. If the court wanted to enforce or modify the order, they would have to fine me. I was sure they didn't care enough to spend the resources to do so. Cheryl, on the other hand, would likely try to get the court to fine me. And of course, if they succeeded, they would have to want me back. Then again, I'm sure they wouldn't want to, given that there are some very serious criminals on the loose. It's not that I'm a deadbeat dad, because if I were a father, I would never leave my kids with nothing. At least I don't consider myself that pathetic of a person. I have done nothing wrong. I was a good and faithful husband whose wife met an old crush, fell in love with him again, and divorced me because of it. Along the way, the court took the only valuable thing I had and gave it to my unworthy ex-wife, who then moved her lover in with her, leaving me with a mortgage on a house I would never live in or own. What a shitty deal that was for me. I decided to spend the first night in a motel and get up early in the morning. In the evening, the motel had a manager's reception, where they served free beer, wine, and appetizers for an hour and a half. The reception area was crowded, and there were tall little round tables around where 2 or 3 people could stand, drink, and enjoy the appetizers. There was only one person standing at one of the tables. I joined him. "Hi, I'm Jason Truesdell," I said. "Tim Ryan. How many hotels have free food and drinks?" He laughed. "About half of the ones I usually stay at do." "And how many do you stay in?" He laughed again. "I spend half my life in them." "That sucks." "Only if you let yourself. If you like to travel and have fun, it's perfect. I take it you don't." "Don't like what?" "Don't like traveling? Or having fun?" "I'm sure I know the answer about sex," he said, smiling. But I was talking about the hotel. This is my first one in months. Maybe you need to go out more. Does your wife keep you on a short leash? No wife, so no leash. What brings you to the motel tonight? I spent the next few minutes telling a complete stranger about my life and how I ended up with him over beer and chicken wings. So you're basically on the run and in hiding. I guess so. What happens when you get caught? I don't know. I don't even know what I'm going to do now. Where are you headed? To Seattle, I guess. I've always wanted to go there. What are you going to do when you get there? I'm an electrician, so I can get a job. Are you in a hurry to get there? I'm more in a hurry to get away from my ex, her lawyer, and possible court problems. He smiled. Grab your beer and come with me. He led me to the parking lot at the back of the building. There was a bus parked in the farthest corner. It wasn't just any bus, it was a multicolored shiny Hulk. He unlocked the door and led me inside. Wow, I exclaimed, looking around. This is fantastic. It was pure luxury, as beautiful as any picture of a house I'd ever seen. Not so bad, huh? He asked. Is this yours? Hell no. That shit cost almost $250,000. I could never afford something like that. I'm just delivering it. To who? Or where? From the factory to the dealership. The very expensive cars are delivered directly to the customer at the factory, and the cheaper ones, like this one, are shipped to dealerships and put into inventory. So that's your job? To ship these things? That's exactly right. But it's not just these big, fancy diesel dudes. I also deliver small vehicles, anything too big to fit in a truck. I pick them up at the factory, drive them to the dealership where they're sold, drop them off, get on a plane, fly back to the factory, and do it all over again. Do you ever get tired of traveling? Not yet, no. I've been doing it for 2 years now, and in all that time I haven't paid a month's rent or made a single mortgage payment. Plus, you have no idea how many women see these things parked in parking lots and want to look inside. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was the goddamn doorbell. Tim opened the door and there stood 2 women. Hi, one of them said. We saw you getting into that thing and wondered if we could take a look inside. Tim looked at me and smiled. Sure. Come on in. The ringing of the doorbell led to a night of unbridled debauchery. The 4 of us frolicked and played on the bus until the early hours of the morning. When they left, Tim and I got to talking. He asked me if I wanted to do the same job. If so, he would call his boss and see what could be done. It only took me 2 seconds to tell him to call. It was too early to call then, so we met for breakfast a couple hours later and he called his boss. I chatted with him and told him my story. He told me to head to the factory and he would see what he could do about the job. Tim and I shook hands and he headed to Chicago to make his delivery, and I headed to Texas. During the trip to the factory, I mentally went over the possible benefits of the job if I got it. First, it would make it harder to find Cheryl, her lawyer, and the court, since I wouldn't have a permanent address. Second, if the night with Tim and the 2 women was any indication, I'd have my share. And third, I'd be saving my paycheck because the company would be paying all my expenses except my car payment and insurance. I then made a list of disadvantages. The list was short. The only thing on it was the delay in getting to Seattle, but that didn't matter much when you took everything else into account. I traveled to the factory in Texas, filled out an application, and interviewed with 4 people in various positions within the company. I even went to the local police station to be fingerprinted for a criminal investigation. I hoped that neither Cheryl nor the court had any cases against me yet. The next day, I spent several hours with the company's security director. He made a copy of my driver's license and sent it to a company that was checking the work history of drivers at some of the bus and truck companies in the country. They were trying to make sure that the people driving their buses around the country were safe, honest, and reliable. I was reliable and safe, but after what I did to get out of town, I couldn't be called honest. To my credit, I made no secret of how I ended up in their factory looking for work. Everyone I talked to sympathized with me. The safety director and I inspected one of the buses from front to back, side to side, and top to bottom. Then I learned that they were carriages and not buses, and he and I walked through one of them with the utmost care. 45 feet long, 8.5 feet wide, and weighing over 30,000 pounds. They were impressive. Then he told me to get in the driver's seat and take a ride with him. We started in a large parking lot, then moved on to state highways, county roads, and finally city streets. The largest vehicle I had driven before was a 26-foot rental truck. Some people are born to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, even Indian chiefs. What about me? I was born to drive inner-city buses. I had a ball. Until then, I had no idea how big the recreational vehicle industry was. My company, I called it that even though I hadn't been hired yet, shipped at least 10 buses and all-terrain vehicles a week to dealerships across the country. The average retail value of their small boats was such that they were affordable for many people. But the retail value of the coaches ranged from $150,000 to over $2 million. All of the expensive boats were delivered to customers at the factory. Expensive meant $1 million and up. All others were shipped to dealerships. At the end of the 3-day process, I was told that I was hired until I passed a criminal background check. I was also informed that they would be paying my motel expenses from that day forward. The results of the criminal background check came back clean and I was hired. I spent the next week at the factory watching the buses being built and learning all of their systems. I also had to pass the written and driving tests for my commercial driver's license, CDL. I studied for the written tests in the evenings, and during the day I studied what I needed to take the pre-trip inspection and driving test. I was assisted in this by a member of the safety department. I passed all the tests and got my CDL. To work there, I had to know every inch of the basic models and have a working knowledge of the more advanced models and systems. I learned that they could almost drive the car themselves. In fact, there was research being done in that very direction. The owners of the company thought that if cars could do it, why couldn't motorized buses do it too? Tim Ryan tapped me on the shoulder one morning. He had just flown in and was going to leave for Florida the next day with another bus. "So, what do you think?" he asked. "I don't understand why they have to find people for this job. You'd think they'd be standing in line for it. It seems perfect." He grinned. "For some of us it is, but most of us find it boring and repetitive after a while. They get tired of traveling, motels, and not having time at home. Even most truck drivers who've tried it don't like it. But for you, heck, it should be perfect. It'll be like the Foreign Legion, a lost man who wants to stay lost and forget his past. People may look for you, but if you don't want to be found, you won't be found. The only paper trail for you will be your paycheck, and since it will be in direct deposit, even that will not be available to the public or those looking for you. You will use the company credit cards to pay for motels, fuel, and food on the road and while you are here. If you only use cash for daily personal expenses, you will have no paper trail. If you need to pay any bills, you can even do it through your bank. It's perfect. I've thought about all of this before and have come to the same conclusion he did. As long as I don't do anything stupid like traffic accidents or use my own credit cards for everyday expenses, I'll be invisible. Invisible until I have to renew my driver's license, and since I just got a new one in Texas, I'll have enough for a few years. And even if I was traced to Texas, I had no permanent address because the residence listed on my license was a motel. On the other hand, my employer could be traced through my taxes and social security number, but I still couldn't imagine any divorce court in the country going to these shenanigans over a missing ex-husband and a house. But who the hell knows? Of course, Cheryl might try to insist on it. At any rate, I felt pretty secure. Before I left my hometown, I even got a cell phone. I transferred the contact information I wanted to keep to it, and I turned off my old phone. And kept it on. I realized that I could be tracked if my old phone was on. I kept it charged and paid the minimum monthly bill, but I never turned it on, and only select people, like my parents, knew I had another phone. Excessive? Perhaps, but it made me feel safer. 2 days after Tim left, I was informed that I was cleared for work and would be going on my first trip in the next couple days. I spent that time practicing driving around the city in coaches waiting to be delivered. My first bus was one of the cheapest, but still cost more than many homes. The manufacturer's suggested retail price, MSRP, was $196,572 plus shipping and taxes. I found storage for my stuff and turned in the rental truck. My pickup will be parked in a covered employee parking lot, so that was already taken care of. Sitting in the open Texas sun for weeks on end isn't too good for cars. I packed a small travel bag, got behind the wheel of the bus, and hit the road. The dealership where I was to deliver the car was located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. According to company regulations, I could drive no more than 500 miles a day. That left a lot of time in motels. I realized that this kind of work would not appeal to many people. At 500 miles a day, the drive to Philadelphia would take 3 days. On the second day of the trip, I drove through my hometown, but it was an interstate highway, so I wasn't worried. I broke the mileage rules that day because I wanted to get out of my home state just in case. I got to Philadelphia, got the bus signed and inspected, and one of their employees took me to the airport. I wasn't able to fly out until the next day, so I spent almost 15 hours in a hotel. No woman wanted to see the inside of the bus that first trip. Or the second. Or the third. That all changed on the fourth. I was headed to Seattle on a $300,000 bus. It was just over 2,200 miles. The trip was scheduled to take 5 days, but my boss said I could do it in 4 if I wanted. I stopped for the night in Salt Lake City. The motel had a manager's reception with beer, wine, and appetizers. It was summer and the reception was held outside near the pool. Alcohol was not allowed in the pool, but swimmers could go out, eat and drink, and return to the pool. The area overlooked the back parking lot, and my coach was sitting there all bright and shiny. "Excuse me," said one of the 2 women standing next to the table I was sitting at. I could see the tops of their bathing suits, but the bottoms were covered by the wet towels they had wrapped themselves in. "Yeah? You're the ones who came here on the bus?" I smiled. Perhaps my luck was about to change. "Yeah, that's me." "And do you live in it?" "No." "Could you if you wanted to?" "Absolutely." "Then why don't you live in it? Why are you spending money on a motel if you have one?" "It's not mine. I'm just delivering it." "Oh? To who or what?" "Neither. This is the dealership where it's going to be sold." "You mean it's for sale?" "It will be." "Can we take a look inside?" I smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." We headed toward the carriage, but they stopped to throw their wet towels into the basket provided for that purpose and take fresh, dry towels. They did not wrap the new towels around their waists, but hung them around their necks. I caught a glimpse of the little bikinis before I turned and led them to the coach. "My name is Lauren, by the way," said the one who had been doing all the talking so far. "And this is Katie." She pointed to her friend. "Hi, Lauren, Katie. I'm Jason." "Hi, Jason," they said in unison. I unlocked the door and indicated for them to come inside. "Holy shit! It's like a palace," Lauren said. "It's like a picture in a magazine," Katie said. "Who buys shit like that?" I chuckled. "People who want to travel and hike, but without sacrificing anything like a flush toilet and satellite TV. It's called glamping." "Flush toilets?" asked Lauren. "Really?" "Sure. Come here." We stood behind where the driver was sitting, but I led them into the bathroom. "Here it is." "Shit. Pardon the expression, but can I rinse it off?" "Sure, go AHE." "OMFG. A shower? Is there a shower here?" she interrupted. "A damn shower? Can I use it?" "Just for fun. I mean, I took a shower on the bus." "Sure, but I'll have to run the generator and heat the water." "That could take a few minutes." "That's okay. We'll watch the rest of this bastard while you do that." I walked over to the control panel and pressed a button. It wasn't audible, but a generator started up downstairs. I knew there wasn't much fresh water in the tank because the factory never filled it up, but Lauren had enough to take a shower, and I smiled at the thought. I spent the next few minutes showing them the rest of the bus. 2 things impressed them the most: the washer and dryer, and the way the mattress in the bedroom hydraulically lifts up to reveal a secret storage compartment and built-in safe. We finished our drinks and Kathy wanted more, so she left and came back with a full bottle of wine. "The bartender likes me," she said and smiled. "How long does it take for the water to heat up?" asked Lauren. "It should be ready by now." "Okay. Can I really do it?" "Go ahead, but the door separating the bathroom from the rest of the wagon isn't activated," I lied. We'll be able to see you. Who cares? She said. After a while, Kathy, who had the remote, put it on the counter. You must think we're crazy and acting like children. I laughed. It's okay. Having these things on wheels is different than having them in the house. Just imagine taking a shower or cooking a meal while rushing down the highway at 70 miles an hour. Anyway, it's really nice of you to show us this bus. It's awesome. They left the coach at 3 in the morning. I spent the rest of the night in it and returned to the motel only to shower, pack my things, and eat breakfast. I was a few hours late to start my 500-mile journey that day. And it went on like that for over a year. I delivered coaches and had fun on about every fourth delivery. That never happened when I had a truck, only with coaches. 6 of my deliveries during that time were in Florida, which was the biggest market for coaches like ours. On each trip, I made arrangements to meet my parents, and each time they reminded me that either Cheryl or her attorney had repeatedly asked them where I was and how to contact me. The last 3 times it was Cheryl who contacted them. She told them that she was alone, without money and desperate. She told this to my father, who without much sympathy told her, "I'm sorry," and never once asked how or why she was in that situation. I figured that if I ever heard anything official, it would be in May or June after the taxes were filed. If the courts wanted to find me, they would track me down through my social security number and through the IRS. I heard nothing and felt relatively safe. Since I started working, I had spent almost no money of my own because the company took care of almost all of my expenses. Consequently, I had more than a year's salary stashed away, in addition to what I had before I started working. I realized that I couldn't work as a trainer forever, so I started planning the next phase of my life. Another year of this kind of work and I was almost, be able to buy a house, unless of course I moved to San Francisco, New York, or some other ridiculously expensive city. I knew Seattle was expensive, but the Pacific Northwest was still calling to me. I'd made it there a few times before, and I really liked the area. The vast majority of the vehicles we built were family or owner-driver vehicles. This means that the owner usually drove the bus, and it was used primarily as a family vacation vehicle. These buses usually seated 2 to 6 people, and the driver's area was not isolated from the rest of the bus. We also built buses that had a separate driver's area. It was not very large, but it partially isolated the driver. These buses were usually built for bands and singers. Some were just for the star and his family or close friends, and some were for groups. The latter could sleep up to 12 people using bunk beds and still have a bathroom, kitchen, plenty of space to eat, romp, write songs, play games, etc. These groups traveled the country and literally lived in carriages for months at a time. The star carriages usually cost at least $1 million, and the star, with few exceptions, would come to the factory to take the order. I had just returned from a trip to Oregon and was supposed to take a couple of days off. I was in a motel when my boss called. "Jason, I have a deal for you." That statement was on par with, "I'm from the government and I want to help you," in terms of arousing total and instant suspicion. "I'm sorry, but I'll be sick that day." "What day?" "What the hell are you talking about?" "Every time you tell me you have a case for me, I end up with no days off because the coach has to be delivered yesterday." That may have been true in the past, but trust me, you're going to love this deal. It was another one of those comments that means trouble. Trust me. "Tom, I'm tired. I need a couple of days off, and I haven't had a vacation since I've been here." "What do you mean, no vacation? You travel all the time and you've been to most of the 48 contiguous states. What more do you need?" I loved my job, and as mentioned, I wanted it to last at least another year. But barring a few visits to my parents' house, I hadn't lived in anything bigger than a motel or hotel room in over a year. "Look," he said, "do this for me and I promise you'll get a vacation." Damn, I thought. In the end, he was more than fair with me. Okay. Where is it supposed to be and when? "It'll be in Nashville, but in a slightly different way." Different? I didn't like the way that sounded. "Different how? And why different?" He chuckled. "Come to my place." An hour later, he and I were standing outside the newly finished coach. "Have you ever heard of Reagan Thompson?" "Isn't she an artist?" I had no idea who she was, whether she painted or sold shoes, and I didn't care. Maybe, but I'm thinking of a different Reagan Thompson. The one I'm thinking of is one of music's newest stars, and that's his coach. It's also his first personal trainer. He traveled with his band in a used coach he bought from another singer, but decided he wanted one just for himself and his family. This is not uncommon for big stars. We build 1 or 2 a year for them. His trainer? Isn't Reagan a girl's name? Not in this case, no. It doesn't matter. What's the deal with his coach? He took a deep breath. He paid over $1 million for it and wants to ride it himself. He spent a lot of time riding around in those cars while he was gaining popularity, but now that he's a big star, he wants his own personal car, and he wants to drive it himself. The problem is, the biggest car he's ever driven is an F-250 pickup, so he wants someone to teach him how to drive it. He looked right at me. And he wants that person to be you. Oh, no, you don't. There are higher-level people than me and more qualified. How about Ryan? Tim Ryan? That's not going to work. He wants you. How can he want me? He doesn't even know me. No, but he knows how you drive. What do you mean? Remember a couple months ago when you took the band's coaching staff to the dealer in Chattanooga, but he had to go to them in Nashville? Yeah. Thompson was in Chattanooga on a personal visit. When he was on his way home to Nashville, he pulled in behind you on the track. Since he was about to have his first coach, he decided to follow you just for fun. He followed you for 2 hours and was impressed with the way you rode, especially over Monteagle. What's Monteagle? I asked. It's a section of the I-24 highway outside of Chattanooga. It's not the longest, highest, or steepest mountain section in the country, but for some reason, its long 6% descent is deceptive and treacherous, especially in bad weather. Drivers tend to be a little careless when they drive on it for the first time. I've never noticed that. That's because you had a brake. A brake is a system on large cars designed to slow down without depressing the brake pedal. It uses engine compression to reduce speed, blah, 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 blah. I don't know how the damn thing works. All I know is that when the car starts going down a hill, the driver just takes his foot off the gas pedal and the car slows down without having to hit the brakes. If you've ever been next to a big truck or bus and heard a loud popping sound, it was probably Jake's brake. It saves a lot of wear and tear on the braking systems of large and heavy vehicles. Anyway, this big star followed me. Right. He liked the way you drove the bus in traffic and decided he wanted you to teach him how to drive yours. He saw the name of the bus and realized it was built by the same company, so he decided to see if the driver, meaning you, could teach him. He's going to California to make his first movie and thought it would be fun to go there in his new bus. You're kidding. Am I acting like I'm joking? I'm really not qualified to... Damn it, Jason. He spent over $1 million goddamn dollars and he wants you to help him. It's no big deal. All you have to do is take a bus to Nashville, pick him and his family up, drive them to California, and teach him how to drive on the way. He hurriedly spoke the last part of his statement and turned away from me. I looked up at him. Excuse me. What did you just say? He turned to me again. You heard me. He wants you to bring the coach to Nashville. I understood that part. But the next part I don't like. Take him to California. Are you serious? Is he serious? He's serious enough to pay you $5 grand for a week's work, plus a first-class flight here when you deliver them. That was a pretty impressive figure, and it caught my attention. Okay, suppose I do that. How many of his family will go, and how many people will sleep in this thing? Him, his wife, his 2 children, and his sister. The carriage will fit 6 people, but you won't be sleeping in the carriage, you'll be sleeping in motels. If everything goes right, it will take about 3 or 4 days. His people will make arrangements for motels every day, depending on how far you get. He paused and looked at me. Come on, Jason. What do you have to lose? You're getting a lot of money to spend time with a famous star. It can't be that bad, can it? He was right, of course. When do I leave? As soon as you can get ready. He can't wait to get to work. Okay. I'll leave in the morning. Good. Let's go into the office and Kat will give you his personal phone number and address. He wants you to call him when you're a couple hours away from his house. I spent the rest of the day familiarizing myself with everything on this million-dollar bus. I'd never towed a car, but I was worried that Reagan Thompson might want to do it, so I asked Kat to call him and see if he wanted us to do it. Mr. Thompson, it's Kat again. Jason is here and he has a question for you. There was a pause. Good. Here it is. She handed the phone to me. It's Jason. Jason. It's good to talk to you. I'm Reagan. What's your question? Were you planning on having a car in tow for our little trip? No. The studio will provide us with a car, so I don't need my own. Good, that makes it a little easier. When you practice driving the coach, we won't have to unhook and hook up the car. He grinned. I had the same thought. How long do you think it will take? Depends on you, I suppose, and how much time you want to spend taking small back roads and driving through towns. Why would we do that? I thought we'd get out on the I-40 freeway and haul ass. Anyone can get on the highway and haul ass, but small roads and towns are where you learn to drive. You're right, and I know it. I want to do it right if I'm going to take this on. When will you be here? I'm leaving in the morning and it's about 600 miles, so let's go the day after tomorrow. I can be there anytime you want. Okay, let's make it 9 in the morning. You show me the carriage and we'll pack it up. We'll leave the next morning. Sounds good to me. I'll see you then. Arriving in Nashville, I checked into a motel for the night. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the gate opened and I pulled into the long, wide driveway. Next to the 5-car garage was a new, much larger garage that I assumed had been built to house a bus. I stopped right in front of it. His wife, mother, father, sister, 2 children, and about a dozen other people were there when I pulled up. When I slowed down, opened the door, and got out of the car, everyone climbed aboard and ran around the cabin opening drawers, checking the refrigerator, getting into the driver's seat, and so on and so forth. Reagan was the only one who introduced himself. I Googled him before I left, so I knew what he looked like, but I was still surprised to see him in real life. Hey, Jason. Did you have any trouble finding me? He asked, shaking my hand. No problems at all. Wow. I've seen him in videos and pictures, but in real life he's just gorgeous, he said, looking at his trainer. Wait until you see inside. Inside, everyone started asking where it was, how it worked, and so on. The 2 kids, 6-year-old twin boys, loved their bunk beds with individual TVs and sound systems. He kicked everyone out, and I spent the next 3 hours telling him all about it. He brought in a professional videographer to explain how everything worked, especially the center control panel, all the remote control devices, and the driver's area. He wanted to be able to go back and review the video when he had a question about how something worked. He also had tape and labeled each remote and what it controls. He was very attentive to detail and asked all the right questions in the right order. I was impressed, but anyone who has spent that much money would want to know as much as possible. After the conversation, he took me to one of the 2 patios of the house where the caterer had set up lunch. There I was formally introduced to his family. His wife, Pat, was very sweet and held my hand as she led me and introduced me to everyone, including members of his group who had shown up sometime during our introduction to Reagan. He insisted I call him that. It was the middle of the afternoon when Reagan's wife, Pat, and his sister, Kelly, began moving boxes into the wagon. Bedding, linens, towels, food, dishes, and anything else necessary for the house to function was moved and stowed. It was evident that they had given good thought to what they might need. I asked if I could get a ride to the motel for the evening. He offered to let me spend the night there, but all my stuff was at the motel, so I declined. He and I went to the garage and he used his code to open the door. The first car I saw was a Range Rover. Reagan walked over to a board on the wall, picked up a bunch of keys, tossed them to me, and said he would see me in the morning. What time do you want to leave? I asked. 7 too early? That suits me fine. If you're here at 6, we can have breakfast before we go out. Great. I'll see you at 6. Just like the day before, the gate opened as I turned into the driveway. I found out later that the house has a camera that alerts you when someone pulls up so they can open the gate. The carriage hadn't moved since I'd parked it the night before. I hadn't expected it to, though. Reagan met me at the garage. We had a hurried breakfast because they were all eager and excited to start the trip. Are you ready to go? Asked Reagan. Always. Are you? Let's go. Do you want me to take the Range Rover out? Asked me. No. One of my guys will take care of it. Let's hit the road. Do you want to drive? I asked him. Oh no. I'll wait until we get on the interstate. Pat sat in the passenger seat and Reagan sat on the stool next to me, and for 3 hours kept asking questions about why I did this or why I did that. Okay. I think I'm ready, he announced. We pulled into the next parking lot where I shut the car off completely and then asked him to tell me the starting procedure as he did so. He was a good student. His first takeoff was smooth as silk. However, his first attempts at using the air brakes almost sent us all into the windshield. Riding down the highway in a nice bus will get you some attention, but at 50 miles per hour, you'll get a lot more than you want when everyone else in traffic is going 80. Lots of honking lets you know that other drivers are frustrated. It took almost an hour before he accelerated to freeway speeds, and another hour before he started to relax. The first time he passed a semi, his knuckles turned white and he was sweating, but he did it. He drove a lot that first day, even as we pulled off the highway to go to the motel. He asked me to pull into the parking lot and park the car. There was a restaurant next to the motel and we all went there for dinner. I sat down next to Kelly and for the first time we had a chance to chat. I learned that she was divorced and living with her brother. Their family was originally from Cleveland, and she herself graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in mass communications. When Reagan started to become a rising star, he and Pat moved to Nashville. He asked Kelly to move with them because he knew he could rely on her to take care of his schedule and press and public relations. By the time we got to California, I was just a passenger and spent most of my time sitting on the couch with Kelly. The twins spent most of their time in their bunk beds and Pat in the passenger seat. The trip took 5 days because we spent time off the trail and even spent 2 nights at RV parks so they could learn how to set up and use the bus as a camper. On one of those nights, Kelly and I slept in the chairs, talking most of the night. Another night, we fell asleep on the couch and woke up in each other's arms. During the trip, Reagan made a lot of phone calls and often used the newly available hands-free feature. I couldn't help but eavesdrop on most of his conversations and learned a lot about the music industry and exchanged investment information with his manager. I took notes and used the investment information to my advantage. In California, Reagan confidently maneuvered through the city and made his way to the home his studio provided. He invited me to spend the first night with them. I agreed because it would probably be the last time I would see any of them, and we had already formed a friendship. I met a few of the studio bigwigs when they came to the house to meet Reagan. When they left and it was just the two of us, Kelly booked plane tickets for the next day and arranged for a car to take me to the airport. Once Reagan and Pat went to bed, Pat gave me a hug, and Reagan handed me an envelope and thanked me for my help in time. Kelly and I talked until 2 in the morning, and when we separated to go to bed, we kissed. The next morning, 2 cars arrived at the same time. One for Reagan and Pat to take them to the studio, and the other to take me to the airport. I said goodbye and gave Kelly a kiss. Reagan and Pat expressed their surprise when they saw this. Well, shit. Maybe we shouldn't say goodbye because it looks like we'll see each other again. And everyone laughed. Will we see each other again? Asked Kelly. Do you want to? Of course. Then you'll see me. Just like my boss Tom said, my flight home went first class. Later that day, I returned to Texas and gave Tom a full report. He told me that the promised $5,000 would be in my next paycheck. That reminded me of the envelope Reagan had given me, so I pulled it out of my pocket and opened it. There was a check for $5,000 and a note. Jason, thank you for your help. Your superiors can't know about this check. Reagan. I laughed and showed the check to Tom. Looks like you had a pretty profitable week. He laughed. My life returned to normal, and 2 days later I left with my coach for Florida. I talked to Kelly several times during that trip, and when I got to Florida, I spent the night at my parents' house and told them about her. They knew about Reagan's music and were fans. 2 months went by and Kelly and I were in frequent contact. I was ready to fly out to see her, but one of our coaches had to fly out there, so I took him. On this trip, I neglected our 500 miles a day driving requirement. I spent 2 days at her place and saw Reagan and Pat a couple times. They were not surprised to see me. Long-distance relationships aren't easy at the best of times, and over the next 4 months, Kelly and I had a few low moments. Those moments didn't stop me from turning down a few ladies who were interested in the coaches I was leading. Kelly and I never had sex. Hell, we never went beyond kissing, but I still turned down opportunities to hook up. Our lowest point came when I took an unexpected trip to California, but was only able to spend one night, and that was the night she had dates planned. Our exclusive relationship was never discussed, but I was still shocked that she was dating others. I say others because when she told me about her date, she also said there were others. After that, our phone conversations became kind of boring and mundane. I started showing women the insides of trainers again, and my life went back to what was the norm for me. The original plan was for Reagan, his family, and Kelly to be in California for 5 months. During my last trip, when Kelly had a previous engagement, I learned that she and her family were returning to Nashville the following week. It got to the point where the phone calls stopped. Once in a while, I would see a picture of him, hear one of his songs, or see a commercial for one of his concerts in some city I was passing through. A few months after our phone conversations stopped, there came a time when Kelly became a distant memory to me as a very nice woman who turned out to be the sister of a big country music star. I'd also almost forgotten about my ex, Cheryl, until my parents called and said they'd gotten a letter from a lawyer addressed to me. "And what did you do with it?" I asked my dad. "Wrote on the front that you don't live here and put it back in the mailbox unopened. We got it this morning and the mailman will pick it up tomorrow." "That's good. Thanks." We both figured it was a letter from Cheryl's lawyer. "What are you going to do with it?" "You can't hide forever." I laughed. "I'm not thinking about hiding, rather, just staying out of her sight." He repeated to himself. "You can't do that forever." "I know, Dad. I'll see what I can do." After our conversation ended, I pulled out my old cell phone and turned it on. The battery was charged, but I wasn't using it. I hadn't spoken to my attorney in almost 2 years, and he was surprised to hear from me. The first thing he told me was that I owed him money. "I thought I paid you before I left," I said. "You paid for the divorce, but not for the shenanigans you pulled." "What shenanigans?" He laughed. "You know what I'm talking about. Collected the insurance money on the house and left town." "Oh, that's a scam." "Yeah, that's exactly it. So before we go any further, you owe me." He spent a couple minutes checking his files, then named the amount. "Holy shit. Why so much?" "You are the official owner of the lot the house stood on, and just because you paid off the mortgage and moved away doesn't mean you have no responsibilities left. You left a pile of ashes and trash on the lot. The city found it unsightly and demanded it be cleaned up. Plus, you were still liable for taxes. The city couldn't find you, but they found me, and I paid for the trash removal, cleaned up the lot, planted grass, paid for insurance in case someone got hurt playing on the lot, and paid the taxes. I also paid to have the grass cut. I figured you'd show up sooner or later, and if you didn't, I'd figure out a way for me to get the property." "Okay, I'll pay, but I need some advice." "Huh. That's good advice. Looks like you didn't need it when you really needed it." "Sorry, but I had a reason." "Yes, and I know what that reason was. I've read the ordinance and I'm no fool." "Then we both know I screwed up big time. She had no right to my house, and then she also had no right to put that asshole in my house. I thought I saw a way out and I took it." "Well, I want you to know that your little ploy worked. Her lawyer called me and was mad as hell. They've been trying to contact you for months to see when you'd build a new house or match her with another one. She, or rather they, moved into an apartment and kept looking for you. Your parents were no help at all when she asked them how to contact you. In the beginning, her lawyer spoke to the judge who issued the order and demanded that you be found and arrested. The judge, came to me and asked me if I knew where you were. I told him I had no idea, and repeated attempts to contact you were unsuccessful because your phone no longer worked. I also told him that I assumed you had interpreted the ordinance as requiring you to provide only this particular house at this particular address, and when or if it ceased to exist, there would be no obligation on your part. He told me that while he agreed with that interpretation, we all know that was not his intent. The law gave him very little discretion, and he essentially had to make the decision as he did. His relatively new clerk messed up the wording, and he failed to proofread it sufficiently before signing and publishing it. I asked him what happens now. He replied that he could not go back and change the published ordinance. He then added that from time to time a miscarriage of justice is corrected by karma. Then he winked at me. It took me a couple of seconds to fully comprehend what he had just told me. So what does that mean? I'm free of any obligation to her? Apparently you are. She went back to court to challenge the order, and the appeals court refused to hear the case, so it's a done deal from the court's point of view. And the property? Obviously it's still there and you still own it, thanks to me. He gave me his bank details. I arranged a transfer of funds to reimburse him and told him I'd come home to have a look around. I then spoke to my boss and brought him up to speed. After the next delivery, I was able to take a vacation. That delivery took me to Nashville. I was just pulling into the dealership with the next group bus. They were all coaches, but the ones built for groups were called group buses when my phone rang. I looked to see who was calling. Hi, Kelly. Hey, Jason. You didn't just stop by the motorhome store, did you? As a matter of fact, I did. Why? I was just driving by and saw one pull up. It made me think of you, so I called. How's it going? Great. Thanks. How are you? Great, too. Listen, do you want to grab some lunch? Or dinner? Sure, why not? It won't take long. Give me 30 minutes. I'll pick you up. It wasn't a long dinner, just time spent with a friend, and we parted with a hug. I wasn't flying out of Nashville until the next day, so I spent the evening trying to decide what I'd gotten out of my relationship with Kelly, what it had been. I decided it wasn't so much her relationship and mine as it was Reagan's and mine. He and I had been in contact for a few months when he had a question about his coach. It happened, what should I do? Or can I go to... It had many programs and features, and he was very conscientious about learning and maintaining his expensive toy. He held several trade shows in Florida and invited my parents to one of them. He met them and spent some time with them and his coach. They loved it. They also met Kelly, and the next time they talked to me, they said they liked her and wanted to know what happened between us. No spark, was my response. After that delivery, I went back to the factory, told my boss I needed a vacation, loaded up the car, and drove home. I didn't know what I was going to do or how long I would be here, so I rented a motel room for a week. They say you can never go home, but it felt good to be back. The first thing I went to do was to look at my property. It was just a green lot that the kids played on, but it was mine, and I fleetingly thought about what it would be like to live here again. I had always loved the neighborhood and the neighbors. I was watching the kids play when there was a knock on the window. I was deep in thought, but was startled. It was my next-door neighbor, Dan Franklin. Dan was the same age as my parents and had lived here for as long as I could remember. Hey, Jason. I thought that was you. How's it going? He asked. I got out of the car, shook his hand, and smiled. Pretty decent, Mr. Franklin. How are you doing yourself? I've had worse. What brings you here? I don't know. Just fighting demons and fond memories, I guess. Do you have time for coffee? We can share some demons and memories if you'd like. 10 minutes later, we were in his kitchen, the same one I'd been in many times. When I was a kid, I'd seen him always add a shot of Bailey's to his coffee, and I wondered what it tasted like. Once I was old enough to try it, I never stopped again. Memories were the first topic of discussion, but it wasn't long before the demons showed up. They started with his opinion of Cheryl and Richard Herbert. Apparently, he had moved in right after I left, and the neighborhood wasn't the same after that. He and Cheryl started fighting almost immediately, and it seemed to disturb the entire neighborhood. While I lived here, Cheryl didn't dislike him, but apparently she changed when he moved in. She stopped interacting with the neighbors and didn't participate in any neighborhood events or social gatherings. On the other hand, he just made enemies and argued with everyone he met. All in all, he was not a very pleasant person. The day the house burned down, Herbert ran out of the house with his guitar and computer and never went back in. He called Cheryl to see if she was okay, but didn't try to go back into the house to see if she needed help getting out. When she came out, flames were shooting out of the downstairs windows, and she was holding jewelry boxes and photo albums. Herbert could be heard yelling at her for bringing her things and not his favorite leather jacket and cowboy boots. They were still arguing while the neighbors watched the house burn. Mr. Franklin said with a chuckle that he heard Cheryl call him a dumb shit for trying to take the roasting stove outside. Apparently, when the rain stopped, he tried to carry the turkey roasting stove outside, but tripped, knocking it over. I remembered that there were rumors to that effect. By the time the fire department arrived, there wasn't much left of the house. Cheryl and Herbert stopped by the next day to see if there was anything left, but left without taking anything. Mr. Franklin saw Cheryl in town several times, but never Herbert. He asked me if I was going to stay in town and build a new house. I've thought about it, but I'm afraid that if I build a new house, it will go to her. Our divorce decree specifically refers to a house at this address. If I remodel the house, she can get the decree and claim it. I'm not going to take that chance. That's too bad, but let me ask you, would you consider selling the land? My grandchildren and all the neighborhood kids love to play there. If you sell it to me, my wife and I will put playground equipment there and make a park. An hour later, we had a deal. I like this town, but I had no more reason to stay here. I went back to my motel and started packing my things, getting ready to leave in the morning. I called my boss and told him I would be back in 3 days and ready to go. We all have favorite places where we like to do things: eat, store, relax, etc. My favorite place in town was a small bar that served food not normally associated with bars. Osso Buco, for example. Not that I was a big fan of Osso Buco specifically, but I loved good food. One of my favorite dishes at this bar was a dish I had never seen on any other bar's menu, the chicken marbella. I had just ordered it and felt someone towering over me. I thought the server had come back for something. I looked up and there stood Cheryl. "You're an asshole," she said. "And you're a slut," I parried. "I hope you're not going to stand there while I eat, because I certainly don't intend to invite you to sit down. It would ruin a perfectly good meal." "How could you do that, Jason? How could you just walk away and leave me homeless? What exactly do you think you did to me? I was kicked out of my house and left homeless because you and another asshole decided you were in love, so you ruined my life and stole my house. Stole it, Cheryl. Brazenly damn stole something you had no right to. I know it was officially done by the courts, but you started it. It was mine too, Jason. It was never yours. It was my home for most of my life. You never lived there long enough to change the linens on the bed. Then you met an old friend and convinced the court that we had irreconcilable differences. What exactly does that mean? You couldn't define it, much less name it. The court saw it differently. Only because of shitty laws that were created to screw over husbands like me who never did anything wrong except marry cheating whores. It wasn't my fault. Legally, she was mine, so I took her. Fine. It's yours. Enjoy what's left of it. Screw you! You've already done that. Now go away. She sat down. No, actually, she plopped down. You owe me, and I want to get it. I don't owe you shit. I did exactly what the divorce decree dictates I do. Nothing more than that. And nothing less. If you don't like it, take it to court. Oh, right. You've already done that and lost. It's not my fault your everlasting love tripped over its own footprint and burned the house to the ground. Now just walk away. Not until I get what I deserve. I started laughing and pointed to the large window at the front of the bar. If you got what you really deserve, a big truck would fly into that window and run you over in the middle of next week. I almost said coach instead of truck, but I didn't want to ruin their image. She changed her tone. Jason, I don't have anything. Richard left me after the fire, and I'm living with my parents. I need help. I don't care what you need. Get another job. Go to school. Find another forever love, but you won't get anything from me. I stood up. Now, thanks to you, I don't feel like eating. You've ruined my life again. Stay away from me, Cheryl. Life is too short to mess it up because of people like you. I walked over to the server and handed him enough money to cover the cost of my lunch. This should be enough to cover my bill. I don't have an appetite anymore. He laughed and pushed my hand away, ignoring the money. Keep it, he said. I have to pay you for the entertainment you just provided. I walked out to what I assumed was applause from men who'd been screwed by ex-wives in courts. I'm usually relatively calm and keep on an even rational keel. I don't scream, yell, throw things, or wish physical violence on anyone, but until this evening, I hadn't had a chance to express my feelings to Cheryl. Most people who know me would have been shocked at the way I spoke to her that time. To be honest, I was shocked myself, but even after I had time to reflect, I didn't regret it. It was cathartic. My first delivery after returning to work was in Seattle. I had been there several times before, delivering coaches, and my initial instincts were confirmed. I liked the area as much, if not more, than any other part of the country I had been to, and I had been to most of them for work. The service manager at the dealership was inspecting the car I had arrived in. He was the one who had to inspect it and sign the acceptance document. I couldn't leave without it. While he was doing the inspection, I was looking at a bus with the most gorgeous paint job I had seen in my history of dealing with buses. It can cost upwards of $100,000 to paint these buses, but I was willing to bet the paint on this bus cost a lot more than that. "Do you think it's okay if I look inside?" I asked the service manager. "Sure. The owner won't mind. He's a nice old guy." "Old? Did you just call me old?" said the gentleman, who laughed as he approached. "Someday, Sammy, you'll go too far and I'll get mad." "And one of these days, Mr. Ferguson, you'll learn to stop calling me Sammy. And you'll remember that you're not allowed back here in the service area. As soon as I can't come back here to watch you treat my overgrown SUV, I'm going to sell it to you and go live in a home for old people. And don't you dare tell me I'm old." "Sammy!" It was obvious that they were communicating as friends who felt comfortable with each other. Mr. Ferguson walked over to me and extended his hand. "Jacob Ferguson, but my friends call me Jake. And this gentleman," he said, pointing to Sammy, "calls me Mr. Ferguson because he never learned to respect his elders." He smiled broadly as we shook hands. "Jason Truesdell. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir." "Don't call me sir. Only people like Sammy should do that." "It'll be a cold day in hell when I call you sir." "You'll have to excuse him, Jason. He's ill-mannered and uneducated, and the management of this establishment has to keep him here and away from the public, or he'll drive away all their business." He paused. "I heard you ask if you could look in my overgrown SUV?" "Yes," I smiled. I'd never heard one of our coaches referred to as an overgrown SUV before. "Do you have your own?" "Oh, no, I just deliver them." "Delivering?" And I told him what I do. "Sounds like a fun job." "Well, come on. Let's take a look inside." He was obviously very proud as he showed me around. At the factory, I saw several carriages worth $1 million or more, and of course I rode in Reagan's carriage. I also saw a few carriages that were close to $2 million, but they were rare. Mr. Ferguson's carriage must have been in that price range, and it must have been at least 2 years old because I never saw it. There were lots of curved cabinets made of rare exotic woods, and the floor was real marble, as were the countertops and walls in the bathroom and shower. Yes, the showers. There were 2 of them, one in each of the 2 bathrooms. Carriages with 2 bathrooms were rare too. My wife and I hate sharing bathrooms, even with kids and grandkids, so we have our own and everyone else has theirs. The engine was one of the biggest we put in our carriages. While 500 GP was pretty much the standard engine for carriages, this one was a 605 GP monster, and, as Mr. Ferguson proudly stated, was a triple-digit carriage. Triple digits meant it would go over 100 miles per hour. I often drove it at 80 and 85, and once accelerated to 100. Then I was among several NASCAR trucks carrying race cars and buses with crews and drivers. They were on their way to another race venue. I looked in my outside mirror and saw them approaching in the Hummer, left lane. When the first of them passed me, I accelerated. By the time the last one passed, I had kept up with them, pulled in behind them, and was tailgate for them. In a convoy of cars, usually large trucks, the person in front is called the front door, and the person behind is called the tailgate. Everyone in between these two is considered to be sitting in the rocking chair because the front and back doors are responsible for finding any law enforcement. Those sitting in the rocking chair can just drive. We drove probably 75 miles at 100 miles per hour, almost bumper to bumper like cars during a race, and didn't seem to fear the law. We actually passed 2 highway patrol cars traveling in the opposite direction. They both had their blue lights on for a couple of seconds as if to warn us, but the front door didn't slow down and we just kept hauling ass. It was exciting and a hell of a lot of fun. Mr. Ferguson and I had been on his bus for about 15 minutes when Sammy brought my ID. "Tell us when you're ready to go and we'll drop you off at the airport," he said. "Mr. Ferguson, if you leave my mechanics alone, you'll be ready to leave in about an hour." "Thanks, Sammy," he said, smiling. Sammy just shook his head and walked away. What do I have to lose with this Sammy thing? I asked. He laughed again. He seemed to enjoy laughing. Our families go way back. He and my son Mark are best friends, and he spent a lot of time at our house growing up. His name is Samuel, but he prefers to be called Sam. He hates Sammy, and I'm the only one who can call him that. He calls me Mr. Ferguson because that's what he's never called me, and I can't convince him to call me Jake. Mark calls Sam's parents by their first names, but Sam just can't do it. When Sam and Mark graduated from high school, they went into the Army. Neither of them wanted to go to college, and that was okay because neither family could afford it anyway. They stayed together and served in the same unit in Afghanistan. They were only there for a couple months and came under fire. They were both wounded and spent a month in a hospital in Germany. For over 2 weeks, we didn't know if they would survive or die. Sam's parents, my wife, and I spent a month in Germany at their bedsides. While in the hospital, we cried and prayed a lot, usually at the same time. When the boys recovered, they were medically discharged from the service and decided to share an apartment. They still live there today. We both thought for a moment before I continued. Without getting personal, you said that neither family could afford college, but you had a high-income coach. What did you do? Did you win the lottery? No. I have an uncle in Louisiana, and a few years ago they found gas on his property. A little piece of swampland of 100 acres, and all of a sudden he had more money than God. He died without ever knowing how much it was worth. Hell, they still don't know. My dad and I were his only blood relatives, so he left everything to us. I always wanted a camper, so I saw my chance and bought one. Good for you, but it's a step or two higher than just a camper. I got a little carried away. It's way more than we'll ever need, but it was affordable and I was in the mood. My wife and I still live in our old house and are happy with it, but the darn thing drew us in like a magnet. We saw it and wanted it. We bought the house next to ours, tore it down, and built a garage for it. The cost of the carriage house, the house we tore down, and the new garage was about 8 times the value of our house. No one ever accused us of being smart. We talked for a few more minutes in the carriage house, and then went to the showroom where there were drinks and snacks. I had a coffee, he had a cappuccino, and we talked some more. I learned that both he and Sam's father, Pete, were carpenters. Pete is still a carpenter now. Jake played a lot of golf, fished, and traveled. I told him my story and he laughed heartily about the house and insurance. He asked what I did before my divorce, and I told him I was an electrician. I also told him I was on my way to Seattle when I met Tim Ryan at the motel and stopped by to drop off the coach. Are you going to do this forever? He asked. Actually, I've kind of given myself another year or so before I find a place where I can settle down. Still thinking about this neighborhood? Probably. I've traveled all over the country with this job and haven't found a place I like better. Shortly after that, Sam came in to tell him that the overgrown SUV was ready and Mr. Ferguson was getting ready to leave. Sammy said you were going to the airport? Yes, but I'm not leaving until tomorrow. I'm having dinner with friends and then going to a concert tonight. What kind of concert? Reagan Thompson. He's... Hell, I know who he is. My wife and daughter adore him. We've been trying to get tickets, but they're already sold out. She's pissed off. Do you really like him? Hell yeah. We drove 400 miles to see him once. She's still trying to find tickets for tonight, but even the scalpers are sold out. How many tickets do you need? Why? Do you have extra? If you do, I'll be a hero. How many? 4. Me, my wife, my daughter, and my son. My daughter's birthday is next week, and we wanted to bring her along. I smiled and pulled out my phone. Mr. Ferguson just stared at me as I dialed some numbers. Hey, Jason. How are you doing? Hey, Reagan. A friend of mine is trying to get tickets to your show tonight, and there's no way he can. Maybe you have an extra 4 lying around? It's for his daughter's birthday. We might be able to get 4. How old is his daughter and what's her name? I'll find out. What's your daughter's name, Mr. Ferguson, and how old is she? Katie, and she's 30. Who are you talking to? Her name is Katie, and she's 30. I repeated into the phone. He laughed. I thought she might be younger. It's pretty unusual for a father to take his 30-year-old daughter anywhere, much less to one of my shows. Shouldn't be a problem. Let me check with Kelly and she'll get back to you in a few minutes. How about you meet us in the green room before the show instead of going out to dinner? The restaurant is preparing a big table and we've invited some local celebrities. Everyone would love to see you. Bring your friends. I want to say hi to them. I smiled. We'll be there. Oh, if there are no seats, your friends can watch from backstage. There's always a bunch of people there. I'll tell them. Thanks, I'll see you tonight. I ended the conversation, looked at Mr. Ferguson and smiled. How do you and your family feel about meeting Reagan Thompson? Are you kidding me? No, sir. He'd heard my side of the conversation, so I told him about Reagan. Just like that? One little phone call and we're having dinner with Reagan Thompson? I can't believe it. Well, let's wait a few minutes and see what Kelly has to say, and I'm not sure the buffet in the arena green room qualifies as dinner. And who's Kelly? His sister. You'll like her. Turns out he more than liked her, as did his son Mark. The Fergusons picked me up at the hotel, and we headed to the arena. Scotty, Reagan's security guard, met us at the entrance to the reserved parking lot and led us inside. The first thing Jake, I was calling him Jake by then, saw was Coach Reagan. As I introduced Kelly to the family, I could feel the spark between her and Mark. It seemed like they had known each other all their lives. My introduction to Kathy Ferguson wasn't even close to that, but we seemed to understand each other too. She worked as a police officer in their town east of Seattle, patrolling the city streets 8 hours a day. To say the evening went well is a vast understatement. It ended with us all sitting in Reagan's station wagon after the show, Mark and Kelly on the couch, Kathy and I at the dinner table, Jake in the driver's seat, and Reagan in the passenger seat. Pat and Grace, Jake's wife, were standing over their husbands, listening to them talk about coaches and looking very bored. Reagan, Pat, and Kelly were supposed to leave the next morning, but decided they would stop by Jake and Grace's house to look at their coach before leaving town. The Fergusons dropped me off at my hotel at the airport, and Katie and I said a leisurely goodbye. The next few months were interesting. Every time I went on vacation, I went to Seattle to be with Kathy. Mark spent his time traveling with Kelly, Reagan, and Pat. In fact, he pretty much took over the job of driving their bus, which, by the way, was for sale, because when Reagan saw Jake's car, she ordered a new one. I quit my job and moved my stuff to be near Katie. Like my home state, I needed a license to work as an electrician. This required a letter from the company where I worked as an electrician and a copy of the license from that state. I also had to pass an exam. All of this took a little time, which I spent buying a house and furniture. I bought a house in the same town where Kathy and her family lived. Kathy did most of the furniture selection. I liked that I could stretch out and live in something larger than a motel or hotel room. The dealership I went to in Seattle had a driving program for new SUV and bus owners. They, and more specifically Sammy, the service manager, asked if I would be interested in teaching new owners how to drive until I got my electrician's license, and even after that if I could. I thought it was a good idea, started practicing and enjoyed it. I studied the study guide for the electrician's exam and figured it was basically the same as the one I had taken in my home state and wasn't too worried about it, so I took my time. But when Kathy said she would move in with me when I passed the exam, my study of the study guide took on an urgency in a personal, erotic, self-centered way. 3 weeks later, I had a roommate and I had never been happier. My life was perfect. Mark and Kelly got married and settled in Nashville. Reagan found someone to handle his public relations and scheduling. He also has a new coach, and he and Jake argue over who is nicer. Jake tries to convince Grace that they need a new, nicer one. Katie and I are fine with that because we could ride him on trips like the current one. I'm busy with my little company of 3, and Kathy is still patrolling the city streets. She'll be doing that for a couple more weeks, and then she'll take a break to get married and have a baby. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.